Boa tarde. Bom dia, boa tarde, pessoal. Obrigado por estarem aqui com a gente hoje. Meu nome é Sebastião Rudas e é com um grande prazer que hoje eu apresento a professora Alejandra Mancilla, que é professora na Universidade de Oslo. Ela é professora de filosofia política na área da filosofia política contemporânea. Ela faz pesquisa em filosofia política da justiça global, filosofia em relação aos direitos territoriais, filosofia do cosmopolitanismo, pobreza, igualdade global, as injustiças do colonialismo e por aí. Ela é atualmente a pesquisadora principal de um projeto financiado pelo European Research Council, que tem como título Dynamic Territory, a Normative Framework for Territory in the Post-Holocene. E, além disso, ela tem uma grande quantidade de pesquisas já publicadas, seja no formato de livro, no formato de artigo. Eu selecionei algumas para vocês terem uma ideia do tipo de pesquisa que ela vem fazendo nos últimos anos. Em 2016, ela publicou o livro The Right of Necessity, Moral Cosmopolitanism and Global Poverty. E, junto com Peter Roberts, ela editou um livro que está por aparecer pela Manchester University Press, chamado Colonialism and Antarctica, Attitudes, Logics and Practices. Ela tem vários artigos publicados, provavelmente o último que saiu publicado no 2023, Climate Justice and Territory. Em 2022 publicou South American Claims in Antarctica, Colonial Migratory. E um pouco mais, um artigo um pouco mais velho, em 2019, na Philosophy Compass, The Human Right to Subsistence. Antes de passar a palavra para a Alejandra, eu queria falar um par de minutos sobre o nosso grupo. Nós somos o grupo de pesquisa Desigualdade e Justiça, que faz parte do Núcleo de Estudos Internacionais do SEBRAP, aqui em São Paulo. As oficinas de pesquisa, das quais esta é uma, elas acontecem sempre de forma virtual. Uma vez por mês, convidamos um pesquisador, uma pesquisadora da área de justiça global amplamente entendida. Essa pessoa distribui com a gente o seu texto e discutimos uma vez por mês. O nosso grupo está aberto a todo mundo. Quem estiver nos assistindo e tiver interesse em participar nas nossas reuniões, simplesmente enviar um e-mail para a gente. Vocês podem encontrar nosso contato nas nossas redes sociais. Nós temos um site, uma conta no Instagram. Eu acho que vocês podem encontrar a nossa conta de Instagram nos comentários, no chat dessa live. É simplesmente entrar em contato com a gente. Não precisa estar vinculado a uma universidade, não precisa ser um pesquisador, simplesmente ter interesse em discutir temas de justiça global. A Alejandra vai falar por em torno de meia hora sobre o seu projeto. Ela está escrevendo um livro sobre a teoria política da governança internacional da Antártica. Hoje a gente vai discutir um pouco o livro dela, mas mais especificamente um dos capítulos do livro. Após a apresentação dela, eu farei uns breves comentários. O Guilherme Cardoso, que também está aqui com a gente, irá fazer também um par de comentários, e depois a gente pode abrir para discussão. Se você tiver alguma pergunta, simplesmente escrever no chat. A palestra da Alejandra será em inglês. Se você querer fazer a sua pergunta em inglês, pode fazer. Se querer fazer a sua pergunta em português, pode fazer em português. A gente dá um jeito de traduzir para ela. Eu vou passar agora para inglês. Alejandra, welcome to our meeting today. It is a great honor to have you with us. I was just telling to the audience that you were going to speak for about 30-35 minutes about the book, about the chapter that you shared with us. Then I will have a couple of comments. Guilherme will comment as well. And then we will pass the word to the audience in the chat. We have in total 2 hours, which I think it is plenty of time to discuss and learn from your research. So Alejandra, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, great. So hello, everyone. Good morning there. It's good afternoon here. And Sebastián, many thanks for the invitation. Yeah, es un poco extraño que voy a hablar en inglés a un público portugués, but in a way, yeah, it's a book that I've thought about in English and I've written in English. So in that sense, I guess it will make, it's more natural in a way to do the presentation in English. But as Sebastián said, I'm happy to take questions in Portuguese if you speak slowly enough that I can understand. I would like to, that presentation is shared. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I think I will, well, as Sebastián said, and as you know, I shared a chapter to read with you, but I would first like to say a bit about like the general framework of this project and what I'm trying to do, and then go more into the details of the specific chapter. So, yeah, I was thinking of doing this, but maybe in this format is a bit hard. If everyone had been in one room, that would have been easier. So I will skip that, I'm afraid. I will just assume that you have some Antarctic knowledge. But if you don't, I'm happy to ask clarificatory questions, to answer clarificatory questions at the end. I can give the answers to this very briefly. So in a way, just so that you have a bit of knowledge, there are 7 states that have claimed territory in Antarctica during the first half of the 20th century. And by the Antarctic Treaty, those claims are, well, forget the pun, frozen, suspended. This is because, in a way, there was no way of agreeing among themselves of who had what. And so they decided, well, we're going to leave sovereignty on the side, and we're going to collaborate together in this continent. Today, there are 29 consultative parties. That means that they have decision-making power. It's not exactly voting because it's a consensus-based system. And there are 25 other countries that are non-consultative, so they can attend the meetings, which are annual, but they cannot, they don't have any political power. And what gives you political power in Antarctica is science. So you have to perform enough science that you become a consultative party. The main objectives of the treaty are peace, scientific cooperation, and after 91, with the environmental protocol, the preservation, the conservation of the environment. So it's supposed to be the most protected space on Earth, but we can also talk about that later. And that question about what happens in 2048, well, nothing happens really, but many people say that this is the end of everything and the treaty will collapse and everyone will go to Antarctica and extract whatever they find. It's not that straightforward. Actually, the thing is that the environmental protocol, when it entered into force in 98, it says there is a 50-year moratorium. So there is no mining during that moratorium. And if everyone is okay with it, we continue with a mineral ban after 2048. But that's the time when if someone wants to have a look at the protocol and change something, that's when it would happen. But there is a lot of disinformation in the news, and sometimes this year appears like, oh, that's the end of everything in Antarctica, pretty much everything as in normative system. So going to the talk today, as Sebastián said, I'm a PI in a project called Dynamic Territory, Dynamite, as I call it. And the idea of the project emerged by a discomfort that I had. So as a political philosopher, I've been interested for a long time on territorial rights, why people claim what they claim, why states say that they own what they own, what are the justifications for that. And most of the literature is very, assumes like this rigidity of the Holocene or stability of the Holocene. So everything is stable. The people normally stay where they are from birth to death, and the climate is relatively predictable and the geography is predictable. And as you well know, that's not the case anymore. And so the question is, well, how can you rethink territorial rights when the climate becomes unstable and unpredictable, when the geography is changing, and when there are big migrations because of this? So that's the main question in the project. But also before the project, I had been interested in Antarctica as a case study for territory because it's a very special situation, as I try to show in this chapter and in this book. And the goal of this book that I've just finished, like the manuscript, is to show how Antarctica can help to rethink territory in some important ways. So that's why the title, the provisional title, is From Sovereignty to Guardianship, Governing Antarctica, Governing the World. And what you read is one chapter in one of the three parts of that book. I'll say a bit more in the next slide. But so the plan is to go through the preliminaries and then sum up the paper and conclude briefly. And then, I think the discussion will probably be the most interesting. So this is the scheme of the book. Oh, I'm afraid I cannot, everything will appear simultaneously, not as in PowerPoint, but never mind. So the first part, it's about occupation. And that's where I talk about how Antarctica was claimed by these 7 states in the first half of the 20th century, and why I think that those claims are very much colonial and why they should be given up. And in a way, that part wants to say, well, at least thanks to the treaty, the claims were not totally forgotten. So countries have not given up their claims, but they are suspended. And I think that suspension is important because it allows countries to think about other things to do in the territory rather than the usual thing, which I think is exploitation of resources. The second part of the book is about representation. So it's about who is the political community in Antarctica. So obviously in Antarctica, there are no human natives. There are tons of wildlife, but no human natives. And despite that, we have a system of governance in Antarctica. And I ask, well, should some of the inhabitants be also part of the demos, of the political community? Or maybe should even Antarctica itself be represented in the Antarctic Treaty and in other international fora where the interests of Antarctica get discussed? So in that part, the limits of representation, I ask about the political constitution of the Antarctic demos. And then in the third part, the limits of protection, and this is where this chapter belongs, I talk about how Antarctica, in one sense, it's the most protected space on Earth, and why I think that some of the governance tools in Antarctica could help to think, for example, about ecoregions, as I do here. But I also show the limits of this protection. So, and I've written about this. I think I'll write more because I think it's really fascinating, fascinating and terrible at the same time, that Antarctica is very protected in the sense that activities in Antarctica are constrained. But what really matters for Antarctica is what's happening beyond Antarctica. So climate change, CO2 emissions. And the same countries that have committed to protecting Antarctica by what they are doing at home are really affecting Antarctica negatively and quite dramatically. So that basically shows that, well, in our times, and maybe it always was like this, but we have only realized to protect a place, you cannot just act on the place, you need to act beyond the place. So that's the main framework of the book. And I think I can now go to the chapter that I sent you. So I will read that quote from Yevgeny Fedorov. So he was a Russian scientist. He was part of the International Geophysical Year, which happened right before the Antarctic Treaty was signed. And you know the times, so it was full Cold War. And he says, is the Antarctic Treaty not an excellent precedent for many other situations in which agreement about activities is required among various countries? Is it not time to think of disseminating to the entire terrestrial globe the principles set forth in this treaty, namely the close collaboration of countries with different social structures for the exploration of nature and the mastery of a broad region of our Earth for peaceful purposes? And I really like this quote because it's from a committed communist, but also from someone who was committed to the principles that were ruling Antarctica, or that were going to, that were just ruling Antarctica. So Fedorov, and it was not just him, so there were others on the other side too, that shared this idea that it was the first time, and this is why so many international lawyers love the Antarctic Treaty, because they say it's like such an exception. It was like a diplomatic feat that countries with very different ideologies at the heat of the Cold War could come together and yet agree that they would leave a whole continent for science mostly, for peaceful research, and later for protection of the environment. So I think I like Fedorov's quote, and I want to take it further in a way in this paper. I want to say, like, yes, in fact, there are certain challenges that we cannot resolve if we keep thinking through this methodological nationalism, that the nation state is the unit, the main political unit to solve all our problems. And I think that Antarctica, the Antarctic framework, is very useful in thinking beyond that methodological nationalism. Now, there are a lot of caveats before I start. So it's a bit funny that in the book, so if you read the first 6 chapters, there's a lot of critiquing the treaty. And this chapter is the first one that is positive, really, and says, like, well, after all the negative things I said, I still think that this is worth looking at. So I will tell you why I think that this is a model, but with lots of qualifications. So I already mentioned this. One thing is what the parties do in Antarctica, but that is not the same as what the parties do for Antarctica or to Antarctica. And this is because of the actions that happen beyond. And this is a problem of fit, as Oran Young calls this, that is not exclusive of the Antarctic Treaty. In general, when you're thinking of environmental governance, you have this problem that the unit over which there is governance is not enough to secure the objectives that you have, for example, protection of the environment. So bear that in mind. The other thing is that when I look at the framework, I look at the legal documents and I don't really say too much about the implementation or how they have been interpreted in fact. I think, for example, that the environmental protocol is a really ambitious document if it were interpreted more ambitiously. But it also can be very conservative and keep the status quo if it's read in that light. So I think that these documents have the potential to be interpreted more ambitiously. And if they are, maybe we don't need to change too much. We need to read them differently. The other thing is that I don't look at the intentions of the countries. So one question that I always get, or almost always get, when I present about this topic is that, oh, you're so naive or you're so idealistic, like states just want power and this is all about power relations and power balance. And I agree. I'm not blind to that. But I think that what is really interesting in Antarctica is that despite all of that, they have achieved some quite impressive results. So I'm not saying that the states have done this willingly and like in the best spirit of beneficence for humanity, and yet it has worked pretty well compared to other places. The other thing is that Antarctica is protected in a qualified way. So there has never been a ban on fishing in Antarctica or on tourism or on bioprospecting. So it's not that there are no economic activities. There are some very important economic activities. And yet the land, well, the land and the ice over the land, the continent, the mass is pretty protected and beyond extraction. And finally, one cynics could say, well, Antarctica protects itself. It's too miserable, too far, too cold, too hard to get there. Why would anyone, like, of course, this is an easy one for states. They just say, we're going to protect and they don't do anything. And fair enough, that's true to a certain extent. But also, if these legal documents had not been in place, well, other things could have happened in Antarctica that have not yet happened. So I still think one has to be, in a way, acknowledge what has been achieved. So that's for starters. And also, again, for those who are not familiar with the history of Antarctica or Antarctic politics, as I said, the treaty was signed in 1959. It was signed by 12 countries. So the 7 claimants, Russia and the US, who were potential claimants, and 3 other countries that had been doing science in Antarctica. And the main aims of the treaty were peace and scientific cooperation and no nuclearization, no militarization of the continent. And there was a point in the 1980s where, there was an energy crisis, like coming from the energy crisis of the 70s. The parties of the Antarctic Treaty started looking at Antarctica as a potential place to go and get mineral, especially oil and gas. And this was CRAMRA there, the acronym, the Convention for the Regulation of Mineral Activities in Antarctica. And this was discussed for 10 years in the treaty. And finally, like when everyone was ready to sign, it crumbled down and the environmental protocol was signed instead. And this was quite surprising and quite sudden. And it's like these turns of tides that that are really surprising, that nobody really expected. So by virtue of the protocol, the most important thing was that the idea of mining was banned for 50 years in Antarctica. And the protocol was also the first instrument in international law that recognizes a place, a natural reserve, as having intrinsic value. Now for international lawyers, and I've asked this and it's pretty funny, intrinsic value basically means something very, very important. If you say intrinsic value to a philosopher, well, it's not just something very, very important. We can talk for hours about intrinsic value. But the idea that there is intrinsic value in Antarctica, so very, very basically, that Antarctica matters for itself, not just instrumentally. That idea was enshrined in this document, I find very surprising and very, in a way, giving grounds for optimism, maybe. So that's the framework. Now, what I try to do in the paper is, well, of course, you haven't read the previous chapters, but building on the previous chapters, what I'm saying is that what is unique about Antarctica is that in terms of regimes, governance regimes, this is not permanent sovereignty over natural resources, as in the case of states, neither is it common heritage of mankind, as the high seas or the deep seabed are. This is a case that is somewhere in between. And that uniqueness is what I think is valuable. So this is Frank Wong. He was the New Zealand delegate when the environmental protocol was being drafted. And I think this quote captures really well this idea that Antarctica is different. So he says, interest in Antarctica's resources continues, inevitably, in a resource-hungry world. At the same time, people are demanding that we change our behavior, that we become more conservation conscious, that we set aside areas from resource development, that we recognize that in some special places, other values must be given primacy. The Antarctic continent is quintessentially one such place. So already at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, there was this idea Antarctica is not just the largest open air laboratory for scientists. It's also the largest remaining wilderness. It's 10% of the Earth's surface, of the terrestrial surface. And it's a place that serves a global function. So maybe I can say more about this in the Q&A if you want, but the idea is this is the global thermostat. So Antarctica regulates the currents, the marine currents, it regulates the winds, the albedo effect, so this reflection of the ice and the snow keeps the temperatures down. It's crucial for the functioning of Earth systems. And all that was in a way known at the time. And the question was like how to then build a protocol that was faithful or that could preserve these values. And I think, excepting for the last thing about like how to preserve Antarctica's functions for the world, I think the protocol was doing quite a good job. So first, let me say something about permanent sovereignty and why I think, or why this is not what happens in Antarctica. And then I think this is important to bear in mind for when we go to the ecoregions more specifically. So the doctrine of permanent sovereignty over natural resources is from 1962, I think, from the 60s. It's a UN doctrine, and it came about at the time of decolonization. So this was basically the economic dimension of decolonization. So the new the new countries, the new colonies that had gained independence, they wanted to own their resources so they could be economically independent. And that made all the sense in the world. And the doctrine says the rights of peoples and nations to permanent sovereignty over the natural wealth and resources must be exercised in the interest of their national development and of the well-being of the people of the state concerned. So notice how inward-looking this is. So why do we need permanent sovereignty? Well, for the well-being of the people in that state and for their national development. It says nothing whatsoever about, well, you know, maybe those resources matter not just for them, but for others. It's very inward-looking. It's very much in line with this idea of states as basically like black boxes that hardly connect to each other and that only in exceptional situations have to coordinate. And under the doctrine of permanent sovereignty, I say this in more detail in the paper, but there are these like first order and second order rights. So there is ownership, but there is also jurisdictional rights, and you can divide them in different incidents or parts. And when you say that a state has permanent sovereignty over natural resources, you're saying, well, the state can decide how those resources are going to be exploited, owned, how the income is going to be generated, if they're going to pay taxes or not on what is extracted, and so on and so forth. So basically, it's a full package of rights over the resources. Now, why do I think that this doctrine is inadequate for environmental protection? It's geared towards exploitation rather than preservation, historically. So I'm not saying that this is something in principle. So Nico Shriver, an international lawyer, he has a whole book on the doctrine of permanent sovereignty. And the book is called, the subtitle is something about like the rights and duties of states. So he recognizes that duties are very important here. But I think that the practice of permanent sovereignty has been above all a practice that prioritizes extraction and exploitation, and preservation is an afterthought, if a thought at all. And I think that's problematic in the specific cases of ecoregions, for example. Now, one could say, well, no, but there are successful examples of protection of the environment, like look at Costa Rica, for example, or look at Bhutan. And sure, there are some states that have protected the environment or are protecting it. But I think that most of the time, there are economic reasons behind. So it's not protection for the sake of the place. It's protection because the tourists will come, or it's protection because someone will give us aid if we don't cut the forest, and so on and so forth. So I think those are the exceptions. They are not the rule. And the other big problem with this doctrine is that the governments in charge are really the ones that can decide what to do with resources, and they can make decisions that have impacts that go way beyond their periods. So there is this problem of short-termism, and then how can we think of a governance that is more long-termist, that is not tied to the government in turn? So that's what I find problematic about permanent sovereignty when it comes to environmental protection. And then we have common heritage of mankind. And many people, if you ask on the street, I guess many would say that Antarctica is a commons, a global commons, and it is common heritage. Probably the majority. Not many people associate Antarctica with being owned by anyone in particular. And this idea of common heritage again emerged in the 60s. And again, the idea was, well, whatever is not yet under the sovereignty of states will be owned by everyone. So it's this idea that all humanity owns this resource or this place or this space, and we all share the profit equally or as equally as possible. So again, I don't think that in principle, this prevents common heritage from focusing on protection. But historically, common heritage has been used, as Christopher Joyner says, a legal device for exploiting resources of the commons. So in the case of the deep seabed, I don't know, maybe some of you are aware of it, but like there is increasing talk of exploiting mineral resources in the deep seabed. And the question is, oh, how do we distribute the profits? Yeah, so if someone said that, yeah, this should be also for the benefit of the worst off, how are we going to do that? So the focus again is on exploitation rather than protection. And here comes Antarctica. So this, it's not that the treaty calls it like this or anything, it's more like I invented the name for it, but I see Antarctica as a case of joint guardianship. And what do I mean by that? I mean that there is no ownership rights of anyone in particular to withdraw, alienate, or derive income from Antarctic resources. And at the same time, there is joint jurisdiction, joint management over the territory by all the states that are consultative parties. The goals, as I said before, it's peace, science, and the protection of the environment. And something that is very unique to the case of Antarctica, it's a governance body that has an advisory committee, the Committee for Environmental Protection. And this committee gives advice every year in all the annual meetings to the delegates, to the political delegates, saying, well, this has been well done, here we're failing, or we haven't looked at this aspect and this should be taken care of. It's advisory. They don't have political power, but they are a permanent presence. And I think that that makes a difference in terms of the decisions that are made. I cannot see you, so I don't know if you're tired or sleeping, but I will assume that you're not, and I will keep going. Okay, so far everything has been about Antarctica. I'm trying to show you why I think that it is a very interesting and unique case of environmental governance. Now, connection to the rest of the world, ecoregions. So, and this is why I decided to present this chapter to you, because, well, I'm sure many of you are very familiar or know way more than me about, for example, how the Amazon forest or the Amazon, the Amazon as such, as a place, is governed, and whether that's adequate or not. And the Amazon is like the perfect example of an ecoregion. So ecoregions are sites of particular importance for biodiversity, where additional conservation attention is needed, and other intact lands of high value for carbon storage and other ecosystem services. So this idea of ecoregions is developed by Eric Dinerstein and other ecologists in two papers from 2020 and 2019, I think it's the other one. And their idea is that globally, we should aim to build a global safety net for ecoregions. And they map the world and they show where these ecoregions are. They take about half of the terrestrial areas inhabited by more than 1 billion people. And they say, well, we need to protect these areas much better if we want to, well, reduce CO2 emissions, halt the biodiversity loss, and in a way, have those two goals as the main, as the ruling goal. Planetary commons is also an expression that came in a paper now from Rockstrom, the one who has been writing about planetary boundaries, and other scientists, where they say something very similar, which is it's not enough with governance of the commons, we need something planetary. Yeah, and this planetary governance has to include these areas, which look a lot like the ecoregions, that are necessary in a way to keep certain Earth systems functioning within human-friendly limits, and that prevent the biodiversity crisis from getting worse, and so on and so forth. So why care about ecoregions? Well, I give 3 reasons, and there are more, but like 3 obvious reasons. I mentioned already 2 of them. So if we want to stop the biodiversity loss and reduce CO2 emissions globally, it's like 2 birds with 1 stone, really. They go together, these 2 things. For scientists, it's about knowledge. So I think we know about 2 million species, and some speculate that there are around 6 million yet that are unknown or hardly known, and we are making them extinct at the highest rate ever. So how do we preserve that knowledge? Well, we preserve ecoregions. It's a pretty good idea. And a third reason that is non-anthropocentric is just because we find that there is value in the non-human natural world. And I will not say much on this, but I think it's pretty intuitive and pretty obvious that we shouldn't think that everything that is not human is just instrumentally valuable. So that would be a third argument to give for this. Now, ecoregions today are all of them under someone's permanent sovereignty or under quite a few states' permanent sovereignty if they're shared, for example, the Amazon. And for the reasons I mentioned before, I think that this is environmentally inadequate. It's not a good way of looking or of solving the problem. So how do I think that Antarctica could help? Well, I think it would be really interesting if we followed this map and said, in these areas, these should be our goals: peace, science, and protection of the environment, and suspending some first order rights. The first order rights are ownership rights. So what I have in mind here is states that are at the moment the sole sovereigns over ecoregions. Their rights when it comes to deciding, ownership and jurisdiction, in fact. So when it comes to deciding who owns this, and does that mean that they have the right to do whatever they want, or is that right going to be very limited? It should be much more limited. So in a way, I'm not saying that states should lose all the rights, but rather those rights should be limited insofar as that matters to keep these ecoregions valuable for the global functions that they serve. And I think that in terms of the jurisdiction, and this is where the joint part comes in, I see this as being a matter of joint governance rather than one state governance. So, for example, Margaret Moore, a political philosopher, Canadian, she has a paper on Canada and the Arctic, and she says, well, it's impossible to justify why Canada owns all the land it owns. It's crazy. But we can say that Canada is still the steward of that territory. So rather than saying Canada owns all the resources, Canada is responsible. It has a duty to protect that territory. I agree with her, but I would go even further and say, well, it's not just a matter of Canada's interests. So I think in that case, one could say, well, it's Canada and other states too that should have some say. And also, vertically, it shouldn't be just states, but also those communities that live in this area. So as I said, like over 1 billion people live in ecoregions. And up to now, I think at best they get listened to, but they don't have any decision-making power. I also think that should change. And those that are like the local stakeholders should obviously have more participation in governance. Now to the objections. So all good and fine, but one could say, well, there are huge disanalogies between the Antarctic case and the rest of the world. So this doesn't really work. So I respond to 4 of them in the paper, and I think they're all pretty weighty and one should look at them. It's not that one can just dismiss them. The first one is the obvious one. So this would be a really unfair proposal for states. So say, okay, Brazil had rights until today, permanent sovereignty, to the Amazon, to the Brazilian Amazon. And now, by virtue of this doctrine, it loses some of its rights, its legitimate rights. And not just that, but the economic development gets limited. Yeah, because now it's not just about Brazil, it's a decision of Brazil and many others, horizontally and vertically. I think that this objection doesn't really work unless one thinks that what is just and what is legitimate doesn't change through time and through changed circumstances. So, as I said at the beginning, I think that historically it made a lot of sense to have the doctrine of permanent sovereignty. So if you see the context, decolonization, freshly new countries, where there were all these multinationals that owned pretty much everything that they had in their land, of course, you do permanent sovereignty. But 70 70 years after, you start wondering, well, does this really work? Or do we need to change the way in which this is done? And here I also want to remind people, like, states are a relatively new invention in human history. So for how long has the modern state been around? Really not much. Like, there are many states that are younger than me. Not that I'm very young, but still. So the idea that whatever was given at T1 has to remain at T2 no matter what, I think it's pretty unrealistic. So I think the law is constantly adapting to changing circumstances. And we're in a situation where the circumstances have changed enough that we have to revise the governance systems that we have. So that would be my response. And in terms of, and the other thing that is very important, when I think that states in a way limit their rights, I also think that other states that were not involved at all have more duties. So in the case of protecting a rainforest, for example, so I'm not saying now all the weight, like all the responsibility of doing it, falls on the shoulders of whoever is there. The idea is that, well, not now it's a common responsibility. So just as now there's joint guardianship, that joint guardianship means just that it's going to be the state together with others. It's going to be a joint responsibility to care for the place. And about economic development, I don't think I will say much except that, well, this has been questioned both by people in developed countries and developing countries, that this idea of permanent growth is not moving us in any right direction, and that we have to think of an alternative path. So that's in terms of the first objection. Now, unfairness to the inhabitants. So in Antarctica, there is nobody. So just like there were no sovereign rights that were taken away because the claimants never had those sovereign rights, here there are no people, whereas in ecoregions there are tons of people. And what about their rights? And here the worry is what is called green colonialism or fortress conservation. And this has happened already in many places, so where conservation is understood as no humans, and humans are displaced so that only nature remains. And I understand this objection, but I think here that what is really interesting is that, well, guardianship maybe sounds a bit too Western and a bit too colonial, but if you try to put that in brackets, the way in which many indigenous communities, or indigenous philosophies rather, the way in which many indigenous philosophies see the relationship to land looks much more like guardianship than sovereignty. So this idea that owning the land is weird, or selling and buying the land is weird, and that we are in a way related to our environment, and that we have to be in permanent, in a way, connection and dialogue with the environment. Those are ideas that are very standard in other non-Western philosophies, and even in some Western philosophies that are not mainstream. So I think that this is not about green colonialism, quite the opposite. It's about empowering people that maybe so far have not had the power to say or to contest the system of private property, sovereign rights. Feasibility. Here, I think it depends how you define feasible. So, of course, you could say, like, look at the world today. Like, do you really think that states are going to get together and happily give away their rights? It can sound, again, very idealistic and very, like, naive. But I will just repeat what I said before. I think that there are sudden changes that nobody was expecting, like the environmental protocol, and then they happen, and then they are normalized. Oh, and yeah, it was obvious that was the thing that should have happened. And that happened, in fact. So, of course, I cannot predict the future. I don't know what will happen, but I can just say, well, why not develop these tools intellectually, and maybe someone takes them and really puts them into practice. So I wouldn't rule that out entirely. And the other thing is the way that states have changed, like what sovereignty itself has changed on time, gives me a bit of hope. So 100 years ago, you could buy territories with people in them and nobody raised their eyebrows. It was like, yeah, that's what you do. Today, we would find that outrageous. Nobody buys territories with people in them. maybe in 100 years, people will say like, wow, really? Like they thought that this ecoregion was like divided into 8 countries and they all did individually what they wanted, and they will think like, what were they thinking? That's my thought on feasibility. I don't think it's obvious that we're destined to fail in this. And finally, one could say, well, why not other models that are not as, in a way, radical as going for the Antarctic model? So you could think of, for example, the Svalbard Treaty or UNESCO's World Heritage Program or private-public partnerships as they exist today in some countries in Africa. And I think these models, maybe they are better than nothing, but they don't question what I'm trying to question here, which is permanent sovereignty over natural resources. So they all take for granted that the individual state is the ultimate sovereign unit that decides what to do or not to do. And I find that that's problematic. That's the wrong way to look at places that are not following the political borders that we have drawn in the map. As for private-public partnerships, if someone is worried about colonialism, well, this is really a worry. So if you have private actors that want to profit from a natural reserve and turn the people into part of the landscape and the entertainment, I think that that's way more problematic than saying joint guardianship instead. So to conclude, some very brief thoughts. So what I've tried to say in this chapter, and I think what I try to say along the book, is that the Antarctic model is a blueprint. So I don't think one can just copy and paste it somewhere else, but I do think it gives good clues and good ideas of how a different governance model in the rest of the world could look like. And this makes me think, well, maybe we should start turning the exception into the rule. So Antarctica has always been classified as an exception, geographically, ecologically, politically. But what if we stopped looking at it as exception? So it's the only place where business has not been done as usual, where extraction has not yet become the rule. So what would happen if protection became the default rather than extraction? So what would happen if we said, well, you give me reasons why you need to exploit a certain resource, rather than you give me reasons why we need to leave that resource alone, as is the case today. And finally, and I don't say much about this in the chapter, but I say quite a lot across the book, I think that the Antarctic model helps to see beyond methodological nationalism and anthropocentrism. And by that, I mean that normally when we start theorizing politically, we have the state, the nation state, as the immediate default unit. And that prevents us from seeing other options of governance. And when it comes to methodological anthropocentrism, well, when we do politics or when we do environmental ethics, when we really create rules, international rules to govern the world, we are thinking of humans as the ultimate unit of concern. And we turn everything else into the background against which human action happens, rather than thinking, actually, there are other actors out there that have their own lives, and what if we took them into account too, rather than just considering them as instruments or resources? So I think I'll stop there and leave time for questions, but muito obrigada. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandra. That was really very fantastic. So what we're going to do now, I will make a brief comment. It's kind of a question that I guess aims to motivate a little bit of discussion, and then Guilherme will also make his reaction to the paper. And I have, I think it's a minor point, a simple point. So I'm totally convinced about this idea of the importance of mainstreaming the idea of guardianship. So let's start seeing territories as places that need to be preserved instead of sources of resources or whatever. What I'm still didn't entirely understand from the paper and from the presentation is the argument that you have for joint guardianship. So why not, instead of saying, yeah, you have sovereignty over the territory, and this is based on state basis idea, well, you have control over this territory, but it is your responsibility to be the guardian of these territories. So why Canada says, I will be the guardian of this territory. I don't want to be in this partnership with the rest of the world. I am perfectly capable of doing it, and I will do it. I guess you might say, well, that this might depend on politics. What if in 10 years Canada has a different government and then they start extracting resources or something like that? But I was also thinking of, this is something very similar to what indigenous populations say in the Amazon forest, for instance. So they say, we want to be the guardians of the Amazon forest. Let's have these lands recognized, indigenous peoples' lands, let's recognize them for indigenous peoples, and let indigenous peoples be the guardians of those territories. Let's just not allow other authorities going there and to take care of these lands. And if I'm not mistaken, there is some. I was reading some weeks ago. There is some evidence that says, well, at least in Brazil, when in those parts in which you have formally recognized lands for indigenous peoples, those lands are the ones that are least. There is least deforestation.
Yeah.
So it seems that it works. It works saying to indigenous populations, you are the guardians of that, and then it is you who are going to take care of these lands. Why not saying, instead of joint guardianship, let's have these local communities being the ones who are going to take care of the land? I'm totally in with you with the idea of guardianship. I'm still, I might have missed by reading the paper, but I'm still not seeing why should we just aim for joint guardianship if local, I'm not even national guardianship, but let's say local communities-based guardianship, like indigenous peoples being the guardians of the Amazon forest, for instance, might be one option. I had a couple of questions more, but I just wanted to put this into the air. I don't know, Guilherme, if you want to make your comments, and then if you want, you respond to this, and people in the audience can prepare their questions as well, and we listen them while we read them. So, Guilherme, do you want to say something?
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Good morning. Thank you, Sebastian. I would like to thank Professor Alejandra for the presentation, for the paper, and of course for accepting to come here to debate with the DesJus community. And I have prepared just a question to start the debate, but before that, I would like to highlight an important aspect of your chapter, the way you approach political theory. And when I decided to pursue political theory, specifically normative political theory, it was because I heard a researcher, Raíssa Ventura, say that normative political theory is a way to imagine new possibilities for the world. While reading your chapter, I was reminded of this because I think you share this conception and this task, and it's part of what we are doing at DesJus. And so I'm very glad for that and for this conference today. And my question is about the anthropocentric perspective on environment preservation and the idea of representing the non-human natural world, specifically about this idea of representation. It seems important to me that, as philosophers, the target of our argument, or those we think we represent, can say, you don't represent me, or I don't agree with you. And this is a crucial aspect of the idea of representation. My question is, how can we formulate plans or interests to represent a non-human world that cannot express itself? So this is my question, and appreciate you again, Alejandra.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you for your very generous comments and very good questions. So yeah, so there's a lot to say for both, but yeah, let me start with Sebastian. So Sebastian, yeah, you agree with the idea of guardianship, but why does it have to be joint? And yeah, this is a fair question to ask. And I think my answer, so I think that part of the reason is that, well, in the case of Canada, it's not that obvious, but if you tell Costa Rica, or no, if you tell like some other, I don't know, Indonesia is one of the countries that has like the largest potential for preserving ecoregions, but they're a developing country. And you say like, oh, Indonesia, now you have all the responsibility, like you're the guardian of your forest. Good luck with that. That seems really unfair. That's where Indonesia can come back and say like, well, and who helps me with this, right? It's joint guardianship. It's not just my responsibility, it's your responsibility too. This is a way what I think that this is, and it's a shame that Yasuni, I don't know if you're familiar with that idea that Correa had like a decade ago, the Yasuni reserve in Ecuador, where he said like, yeah, so there is this forest, and under the forest there is a lot of oil. Ecuador can say, okay, we're not going to get the oil out, so we're not going to destroy the forest, but hello, like we need help. So why don't you give us, international community, you give us some money, so at least, you know, we're partially compensated for the loss, the loss of not extracting the oil. So I think it's really important that you don't throw all the responsibility into the shoulders of whoever has the forest left. That's really unfair. And there you could also say like, Bolsonaro said like, hey, hello, Europeans, you destroyed your forests and now you want us to preserve ours. Like, don't tell me what to do. And I think the only way to respond to a claim like that is to say like, well, no, because it's joint responsibility. It's not just your responsibility, but it's also not just your right. So it has to be, both sides have to be shared in a way. So that would be my response. And in terms of the local communities, I would say yes, but not just, because I mean, I think there's also a danger to idealize local communities and to say like, oh, you know, they're great at preserving and protecting their environments. And many times they are, but many times they are not. And what if the local community is very happy to just extract everything out and get rich, you know? And what do you want to say there? Well, yeah, they're the locals, they have the right. I think that's problematic too. So in a way, I think it's really important to have like these various levels of governance. That's why I was saying like horizontally and vertically. So there have to be like smaller units and larger units, but also like, yeah, horizontal. So among states, not just one state. That would be like my short answer. And in terms of I don't know if that answers the question more or less. Good. Yes. Thank you. And yeah, how to represent those who cannot speak. So this is a really hard question. Some philosophers answer with the easy answer, which is like, oh, but babies cannot speak and the parents represent them, right? So, but I think it's more complicated in the case of nature. So I can tell you now, like this is not part, this is like my activist side. I'm part of a group called the Antarctic Declaration or Antarctic Rights. I can send you the webpage later. It's antarcticrights.com basically. And we're a group of people with various interests, so many scholars, academics, but also activists, NGOs. And the idea is to say Antarctica should turn into a legal entity. So Antarctica should be its own, you know, like legal person internationally. And of course, it's very idealistic. And of course, the question raises like, who is going to be the representative, right? So when Antarctica sits at the UNFCCC, like, okay, who is going to sit there in the name of Antarctica? And I don't think I have a positive answer. I have more of a negative answer. So I think it would be a terrible idea if it were just one representative. So if it's just one, like one voice, that wouldn't work at all. I think it's more about like a plurality of voices and diversity of interests. And if you study environmental philosophy or environmental ethics and animal ethics, you realize that from the outside, you would think, yeah, they all think the same, they're all in agreement, and they are not. They have totally different ideas. So even among like the people who are worried about animal rights, they will give you totally different accounts of what matters for the animals. And they're all very smart people, and they all give very good arguments. So I think that just tells you it's very complicated, and I would say like lots of different voices, not just one. Whether that solves the problem, I'm not sure, but I also see what we have now, and it's so terribly defective. So it's like totally ignoring all this other world. So yeah, but it's not easy. I agree.
Thank you, Alejandra. Do you have any comment, Guillermo, to Alejandra's answer? Do you want to say something, or should we go to the chat?
I think that going to the chat.
Okay, we have a couple of questions. Let me just figure this out. How do I do it? I open here. So I will have to read the question, Alejandra. I think you can also see it on your screen.
I see 2 lines. I don't know if that's the whole question. Yeah, considering the issue of joint guardianship of ecoregions within sovereign countries.
Okay. Well, I will read it.
Yeah, so read it.
Lucas Petroni, who is also from our group, he says, "Thank you for your talk. Theme and approach are insightful, and your model offers much to consider."
Thank you.
Then he goes on, considering the issue of joint guardianship of ecoregions within sovereign countries, such as the Amazon rainforest, I still think that the concern about green colonialism is present. Historically, there has never been a comparable scenario where poorer countries had a stake in the agricultural or energy policies of wealthier nations, such as those in Europe. Isn't it necessary for the global north to provide historic reparations for their ecological depletion before implementing such a model? Joint guardianship implies historic reparations, he asks.
Yeah.
Do you want to on that one, and then there is Haisa? I think we can go one by one. Do you prefer?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's a great question. So yeah, and I think I will repeat a bit what I said to Sebastian first, that I think, well, so I don't, it's true, I don't say much about like what would be this mechanism, like why would it work? And maybe the reason is, yeah, it's a bit of a lazy reason. I think that there have been really smart philosophers who have done this. So I can give you one place to look at, but Chris Armstrong, he has a book about, I haven't read his book that just came out about conservation and global justice, but he has a few papers on this. And there is one paper where he says like, yeah, so if we're going to do this, he's not talking about joint guardianship, but he's talking about what you're asking, like, why should poor countries, developing countries, now, like take on this responsibility, and like, what are the others going to do? Like, what are they owed anything for this? And he says that there are 3 principles, and they're not very different from the ones we use for when we think about mitigation. So like, who is going to reduce the CO2 emissions and how we're going to do it? Well, it's like the historically responsible. So obviously here, yeah, those who have used more and those who have put us into trouble obviously should have more responsibility in solving this. And also viability. So if some states are in a better position, they should help others who are not in such a good position. So I think that that's obviously part of the picture. Of course, how to implement, I don't go into the nitty-gritty of implementation, but I think that obviously the idea of historical reparation is very important. And here I would also like to add, I mean, this is a topic for a different conversation, but I think it's really interesting that now when we think about of global commons or ecoregions, yeah, we're just thinking of what is left. So it's like, oh my God, like we only have like these 3 forests left in the world, and now, oof, we have to preserve them. And much less is said about like all the forests that were cut and where now there are other activities, and nobody talks about, well, what about if we plant them back? So of course there is a topic of rewilding, the idea that some places should be brought back to wild, but they are at a very little scale in comparison to what is aimed at here. So when you say like, oh, preserve the whole Amazon, that's not the same as saying like, oh, we're going to rewild the outskirts of some European city. So I think there should be much more attention into how the states that have already developed, how they are using their land and what potential they have to repair what they have ruined. So I would say those 2 aspects are different, different and complementary, like helping those who still have some biodiversity and restoring what has been lost. Yeah.
Great. We have another question by Raisa. She says, my question is about your response to the objections, especially regarding the criticism that the model is a form of green colonialism. I concur with your position that indigenous populations often conceptualize their relationship with the land more in terms of guardianship than ownership or sovereignty. However, I am interested in thinking further about the composition of the joint guardianship model. Specifically, who are the international actors, including other states, envisioned as part of this joint guardianship? It appears that whether or not this model can be characterized as green colonialism hinged on the identity of these joint guardians. Could you elaborate on your perspective regarding the definition of these actors, these different subjects who participate in decision-making about these territories? E o mais importante, many thanks for the excellent chapter and insightful thought.
Oh, thanks a lot. Thank you. Yeah, and very good question again. Yeah, so elaborate on who would this be? So I have to say I'm a bit inspired here by, not that I've read the whole Elinor Ostrom, but this idea of polycentric governance, I think is very useful to think about joint guardianship. So I don't know if you're familiar with her, but the economist and her idea, so she was studying like the commons, but at a very local scale, so small scale commons. And her point was like, when she started thinking about the global commons, she has this idea that you need different levels. So a bit what I was saying before, like that's why it's polycentric, because there is so much information that is going to be relevant that you cannot just have one actor or 2, or this goes back to the representing the non-human. Like you cannot just have one voice, because they can be very smart, but they're going to miss a lot of other things that they just don't see, or they just don't have available. So it's very important to have different voices at different levels. More specifically, so I think, okay, so if we go very concretely, like in ecoregion, I would say the local communities should definitely be part. So I think that's like non-negotiable. And so far, at least as how I understand this, local communities, maybe they get invited to meetings where decisions are made, or they get sent like like, oh, we have this project and what do you think about it? So they are consulted, but they are just advisory in the best case. So they don't have any decision-making power. I think they should have some decision-making power, but not just them. So I think it's also important, so I would keep states. I don't think I would just get rid of the whole idea, although I see states like very differently than how they work now. And when it comes to like other actors, I think that the idea of the Committee for Environmental Protection in the case of Antarctica is really interesting. So I don't want to say that scientists know it all, but scientists know some things. And I think that, for example, having scientists that take part in these decisions would be an interesting idea, or at least one should try it. Robin Eckersley, who is a political theorist who writes about rights of nature and like representing nature, but she does this at the level of the state, not at the global level. She says something that might be useful here. It's like, okay, and this is back to representing the non-human natural world, like who should speak for them? And she says, well, those who know. So here you could think like, okay, scientists, those that study these environments, also those who care. And here the group opens, because it's NGOs, maybe environmental NGOs would be the obvious ones. But as I'm sure you know, environmental NGOs also have their agendas, and sometimes they are not necessarily in agreement. So again, we would have to say like, well, not just one NGO, but maybe like a multiplicity, and people who care. So, and here I go back to the Antarctic Rights Declaration. Sometimes things happen organically. The problem is that I think like the way in which our world is set makes it really hard to have truly global or cosmopolitan or transnational political groups, because we are in different places. So the best we can get is this, like we communicate by Zoom or by some, like virtual means. Getting together is really hard. Obviously, we don't have any common jurisdiction, but I think so this possibility of like having more transnational civil society speaking would also be really important. Maybe this virtual means will help that, but I don't know. But I would say both, like from the micro to the macro, and also like horizontally, different views at each of those levels, because not all locals will be in agreement, and not all states will be in agreement, and etc. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So while we have more questions from the chat, I wanted to ask something, perhaps about the last objection that you were you were addressing, about why not other models. And I was thinking, well, this is perhaps mixing several of the objections. It seems that, if I understood correctly, the Antarctic Treaty was kind of a balance of power. At the end of the day, they couldn't get an agreement, and they decided, okay, let's just stop our claims of sovereignty over this territory, and we all do this together, because that was kind of the best way to prevent conflict. So it seems that what we might get might not be the ideal. So let's say the joint guardianship model is the ideal model that we have, the best that we have. Perhaps that we might get what is feasible, considering the distribution of forces that we have today, and we might, I guess, I'm just speculating here, we might see that it is more popular that we have a more capitalistic written solution to protection of the Amazon forest. So let's say, let's take care of supply chains. So let's make sure that the beef that we are eating doesn't come from deforestation in the Amazon. So let's have labels in the beef. So let's just put pressure on companies so they do not deforestate, and if they deforestate, we call them into accountability. And that seems not ideal. I would bet that you are in disagreement with that, but that seems more feasible. That seems that this is something that is easier to convince capitalists of doing. Okay, yeah, they will protect the Amazon, but they will continue exploiting resources somewhere else. So I was curious to know, what do you think of these kind of solutions, which seem to be more structurally similar with the Antarctic Treaty, in the sense that it is what is feasible, it is what seems possible to be done today, and perhaps in 50 years someone is writing a book about, look how these people were smart enough to get feasible things right, and then they decided to do the supply chains control, and they solved the ecoregions. I just want to know, what's your objection to that?
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, I think I have quite a few objections. So, okay, but first let me say, I think if that worked, that would be better than what we have, probably. But even if it would be, again, it would be like just basing ourselves in the results, but not looking at like what's behind, in a way. And if you look at what's behind, I think, okay, no, maybe I'll start again. Even if it's about the results, I don't think it really works. So you can say this idea has been used in other places. So like this idea of certifying the tuna, for example. So like, oh, your tuna was like it's environmentally sustainable. You can eat it, and it's not going to be, like tuna is not going to go extinct because of what you're eating. And there have been tons of investigative reports saying like, no, that doesn't work like that. There's a lot of corruption, and people say that it is sustainable and it is not. So it's really hard to certify. So I would say like, yeah, it's not obvious that it's so easy to say like, oh, this supply chain is pure and clean and you can trust it. It's really hard to do. It's very costly to do. And the thing about like just putting economic pressure, I mean, sure, you can put economic pressure, but the problem with just doing that, I think it's in the end it's cosmetic, so it doesn't go to the root of the problem. And I think the root of the problem is we need a different approach to relate ourselves to the world. And as we have it, the way in which we relate to the world, like through capitalism and through misunderstood liberalism, I would say, is that everything that is not human is really a resource. And even humans are resources. I mean, human resources is something that exists even in the universities, right? So this instrumentalization of everything, I think, is a problem. So I think we have to go deeper, really. But maybe this is a lot to ask, but again, I think one could say, well, of course, like states as we have them today, even though the democracies are like, okay, we're still, beginning. So it's like relatively new systems, even though democracy is an old thing, but I would like, as we practice them today, this is relatively new. We have to give them time. We have to keep, like accommodating and fixing. I think it's the same here. Like we need to, okay, we have this system of states, but what do we do with it? We cannot just pretend that everything is working and we just keep everything as it is. And same with the economic, with the idea of supply chains and fixing it through economic pressure. So I would say it's not enough because it doesn't touch the heart. It doesn't go to the heart of the thing.
Even if it worked. So it would be, even if somehow they managed to find a way that, okay, we've been for 50 years now, the Amazon is protected, even if we solve the technical problem of tracing the origins of this, you would say, well, it might be working, but it is based on kind of grounds that are objectionable. That's kind of...
Yeah, no, that's a hard question. I guess my answer would be like, so if you ask me 50 years and if the alternative was like, just cut the whole thing and grow soy, of course I would say like, that was much better. But I'm not sure you could really make the analog with the Antarctic Treaty. So again, I mean, as you rightly say, the Antarctic Treaty was about politics and power balance. And it wasn't that, they were, we're going to do this for the sake of humanity. But still, if you read right before the treaty, like the years before the treaty, no one thought that this was going to happen. So it was quite surprising that it happened. So I guess I'm more ambitious and I'm thinking like, I hope that something like this happens here, like everyone says it's impossible, like they will never do it. And all of a sudden, it happens. Yeah.
Okay.
But this is pure speculation. I'm sorry. This is
it's as Guillermo said before, it is very interesting to get started thinking about what might work and what kind of models we can implement and which ones are more plausible than the others. Guillermo, do you have any other comments, Guillermo, on Alejandra's talk? Any other questions that you might want to pose? Or...
I'm satisfied with the question from the chat, specifically for the Lucas question. I think a similar question, but I am satisfied. If don't have more questions?
Well, I would like to, if no more people have questions, I would like to ask perhaps a final question. So how do you imagine, and I'm asking this because this is a question that I always get by my students in international relations about enforcement mechanisms. So you have this idea of joint guardianship and say in Brazil people are not behaving very well and they continue to deforestation. Do you imagine this getting into the system of international norms that might be comparable to human rights violations and perhaps getting severe sanctions or intervention or something like that? How do you see this as getting as an international norm?
Yeah, no, this is a really hard question because if you're teaching that, well, like international law, when it comes to enforcement, you go like, just hope for the better. I mean, unless you have like a global authority, how are you going to enforce? And the risk with intervention, as you well know, like humanitarian intervention, well, most of the time ends up being a humanitarian disaster rather than something good. So I would say here again, like one has to be really cautious. But yeah, I see, states as constraining themselves. But of course, this is again very idealistic. So yeah, more emphasis on duties and less emphasis on rights. But of course, is this how the world works? And if we look around, maybe not. And I guess this is why, I don't know if you're familiar, but like there are more and more proposals for enlightened despotisms, and many people are looking to China and saying like, oh, China is the solution. Let China rule. Like we need less democracy and more authoritarianism of the enlightened kind. I think I would stay with, I prefer like the democratic solution, even if it can give trouble in the in-between. I think that going for authoritarianism is very problematic. And I think people who say this normally don't come from South America. So they don't really know how authoritarianisms work. But can I, if there is time, can I ask you a question? Or
okay,
because I mean, you live in Brazil. Brazil is big, so you don't live in the Amazon, but I'm sure you know quite a lot about how it works, that like the governance. Is there any talk about anything like this, or this is totally like out of the map, like out of the question?
You mean
like is when, for example, when Bolsonaro started like changing all the use of these sectors and said like, open for development, and there was a lot of pushback from the global community. Like, was there any talk in Brazil like, like we should not be like, it shouldn't be the government that's responsible for this, but we should be like, I don't know, like having some joint guardianship with the neighbors or with the UN, or I don't know, like.
I lost you for a while, so I didn't get a part of the question, but I'm a bit so. I live in Brazil. I'm not Brazilian. I'm surrounded by Brazilians here, and I'm scared to say something that is very silly about Brazilian politics. But I do know that there is. So in Brazil, it seems to work the standard picture that local governments tend to be much more in favor of deforestation, and the federal government tends to be more in favor of enforcing the constitution, which says that it has to protect the regions. So populations who are interested in protecting the environment in the Amazon forest, they tend to go to the federal government, tend to bypass local governments, because local governments are captured by developers in the regions. I know that in other South American countries it is similar, and there is also, they tend to go to international courts as well. So that suggests that there is some local support from this kind of different levels of governance. So the indigenous peoples, for instance, they might claim to be the ones who are taking care of the region. They want the lands for them. They don't say they want the lands to develop the lands. They have these cosmologies that you were mentioning before. But they are very quick in going into to the federal level, and in certain cases going to International Court of Human Rights, and so on. So it seems to be that there is some acceptance of at least delegating powers to higher authorities. Seems to be strategic as well, right? Because local governments are the ones who are deforesting, are the ones who are allowing this to happen. But I'm very scared of saying something very, very silly about Brazilian politics. I don't know, Guilherme, do you have any answer to Alejandra's question? Do you have maybe you're more informed than me?
Oh, I don't know about this. I think together you, but I don't know specifically.
I'm sorry. Lucas is sharing with us here in the chat, in the internal chat here, a paper that might be interesting to you. I think it is in Portuguese. It is in Portuguese, but it might be interesting. Maybe I can just put it somewhere where you can see it. So there are some reports. So there is this, the Amazon under Bolsonaro. So it seems to be a report on how the last government but I can send it to you, or maybe Lucas in the YouTube chat you can put the link, and then Alejandra you can download it.
Well, but I wrote the name down, so if that's a name, I should be able to find it. It is. Well, that's the
English version, Amazonias of Bolsonaro. I can send you the link as well later.
I think it's really interesting because, like in South America, so I'm originally Chilean from Punta Arenas, from Patagonia, and we have like these ice fields, right? So in between the north and the south, it's like this massive ice field. It's like the third largest after Antarctica and Greenland, and it's shared between Chile and Argentina. And the border has been a problem since I know about it. So it's like always, where is the border? And the Chileans are losing like so many hectares, and the Argentinians are doing this and that. And it's like a constant source of conflict. And if you look at the place, you wonder why it's divided in two in the first place. I mean, it's the most ridiculous thing. Like if you think that two states have individual sovereignty over the two separate chunks in a place where the ice is moving. So, I mean, how do you divide that, right? Good luck with that. So I was talking to a friend glaciologist, and he was in this glaciology conference, and I think it was mostly Argentinians and Chileans, and it was very like sovereignty loaded, we need like a clear demarcation. And you think like, why do we need a demarcation at all? Like the obvious thing there would be to say like joint guardianship over the ice field and forget about putting lines in the middle, like let's do it together. But there is this very strong resistance on both parts.
Are there, I'm not sure, are there any people who are natives from Antarctica?
Zero.
There isn't?
No, nothing. So that's what makes it so fascinating, that there were no natives so that when the because I mean, lots of the ones who got there first were in the colonial tour around the world, and they just stopped in Antarctica, and it was like, we will claim this island. And then there weren't any people, so they said things like, it's so easy and it's such a Pacific conquest because like nobody contests our titles. They just went and claimed. Very easy. Some penguins complained, but apart from that.
Okay, that's it's a very interesting topic, very interesting conversation. I'm sure it was very interesting for us to discuss your paper, to read your paper. I hope it was interesting for you to discuss it with us. if we don't have more questions from the audience, I think we can finish now. Thank you very much
Thank you.
for accepting our invitation.
Thanks a lot for inviting and for the good questions.
We are looking forward to see the book published. And maybe we can discuss the book when it comes out. And
I will let you know.
Thank you, Alejandra.
Great. Thank you. Have a good
Thank
day.
Sebastian for this presentation. Was amazing. Thank you.
okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.